So, guys, I want to talk about the South Park episode Sexual Harassment Panda. And I definitely think it's one of those episodes that are extremely avant garde. And there's a lot of different themes in this. So, I definitely want to break it down scene by scene. But before I start, I do want to talk about some themes about this. I do think that the big message is what we're teaching the next generation and how children are raised nowadays. Where, like I do work in a psych ward. So sometimes, like, what happens is that, while I'm cleaning, there may be some kids that have to be restrained or put into quiet rooms and other things like that. And the first thing they say is assault or I'm going to press charges or other things like that. And sometimes, and when I was a kid, that didn't really exist. So sometimes what happens is that we raise our children to think that they can file sexual harassment lawsuits or they can press charges on people or they can always use the legal system to go what they want. And there's a lot of people who say that that's a bad form of parenting and teaching people, because what happens is you raise a generation of people who just victim blame or be vindictive or take things out of context, really. And I think that that's kind of the theme of Sexual Harassment Panda. So the episode starts where they're at school and Mr. Garrison has to teach children about sexual harassment. And this is definitely very relevant because obviously during this time, the late 90s, people would talk about sexual harassment and other issues going on. And so he brings in Petey the Sexual Harassment Panda. And then what happens is that there's a couple of things that, Mr. Garrison asked everybody what is sexual harassment, and Cartman just talks about a sexual thing that's kind of like a reach around, like somebody tickling your balls from behind. And then Mr. Garrison knows that's something else, really. And here's the first issue that Trey and Matt are talking about, that obviously we all know that Leanne Cartman is a big slut. There's people like Chef who go over to her house to have sex with her. And then also, there's another episode where Cartman talks about his mom being on crack and having a couple of guys over and whatever, and being forced to dress up like a mailman. So obviously, sometimes I think what Trey and Matt are saying when you look at Cartman's character, that sometimes, if there's children who talk about sex or respond to a question like what is sexual harassment, and they provide a very graphic answer, that should be looked into. And that should be really looked into, like, how do these kids know so much about sex? Is it that they watch porn? Is there something inappropriate going on in the household? And definitely, I think Cartman is exposed to a lot of his mother's very promiscuous behavior because, obviously he's in the same house, with her. And he also knows that his mom's the town whore. So that's the first thing, is that that just teaching sexual harassment is not enough. We always have to look into the lives of kids and see, if there's anything going on with them, if they know a lot about sex at a young age. And then Petey the Sexual Harassment Panda comes in, and then he does a song, and then he explains sexual harassment to people. And I also think that another thing that happens is that he gives everybody long books on sexual harassment and goes over it. And I think what happens with that is that's also another thing that happens, where there's a lot of times where we try to teach information that's important to children, but there is a comical way where you have a sexual harassment panda, and then there's also another way where you're trying to teach kids stuff that's legal stuff. So you're going to have them read articles of Title IX and articles of sexual harassment or illegal stuff. So that's not really good for children, because that's not a way to kind of make them process information. A lot of things go over their head. And then what happens is Cartman accuses Stan of calling him an ass sucker. And that's kind of like the other big thing, is that Cartman's not doing that because he got sexually harassed. He's doing that to be vindictive. And that's also kind of another thing that happens a lot with children. There is actual sexual harassment, but there is children being taught that you can use the court as a way to get somebody arrested or to sue somebody to be vindictive, or another situation is that there can actually be something where a person thinks that because they're a good manipulator and a good liar, that they can get away with ruining somebody's life by bringing something into court when that's actually not true. or something like, obviously, Stan and Cartman are friends. So obviously when Stan calls Cartman an ass sucker, it's not meant to sexually harass Cartman. It's meant to just be two people breaking each other's balls. So, Cartman goes to court, and then you see Kyle's dad, the Jewish lawyer. He's living up to the Jewish stereotype. And then also, I think with Kyle's dad, you're kind of seeing how his lack of ethics. Like definitely that situation should be dealt with at school. It should have been dealt with Cartman going to court. And then also too, like Cartman gets like half of Stan's stuff really. So the thing about it is that you're seeing a couple of things. Like Cartman's a very manipulative person, so obviously that's why he won in court, because he was able to be manipulative. And he's not doing that because he was sexually harassed. He's doing that because he wants to. He found a new way to fuck over people by bringing things to court. And then also too, the other thing is that it also shows something about Gerald teaching Cartman bad lessons, because Gerald says to Cartman, "You should sue the school. We'll get like maybe close to 1.5 million." And usually with lawyers, they usually get like maybe 50 or like 50 to 40% cut or something like that. So obviously every lawsuit he's getting, that's like 0.5 million, whatever. He's probably collecting, maybe $500,000 or, probably $400,000 to $500,000, every single time it happens, really, So obviously, encouraging Cartman to press more and more cases. You're also kind of seeing a little bit of Gerald's character, which is he's definitely very manipulative. And he's also maybe in a sense a sociopath. He's definitely trying. He only cares about making money. He only cares about using people's, ignorance to sue people, just to make more money and just to kind of get out on top, really. And some people have that mentality of, what, if there's an edge, I'm gonna go take it. I'm gonna go for the juggler, really. So that all happens, and then you kind of see what happens in the school, like that. Cartman has some really nice stuff, really, and then he has nice shoes. He has a nice wristwatch. And then also, Mr. Garrison is using a nail to for the chalkboard type of thing. So there's definitely kind of like a sense of what Trey and Matt are saying to, like, money isn't free. So obviously suing the school or whatever, people may think that, well, taxpayers fund it, so it's not, so it's a small dent. It's actually a big dent. And then there's also layoffs and other things like that happen in the sexual harassment panda. And there's a lot of layoffs that are going around nowadays with people not wanting to go to college, or there's lawsuits or other things like that, or COVID. People just have learned to be entrepreneurs. So obviously, sexual harassment's one thing, and all those other examples are other things. But obviously when people sue people, they're not really just thinking about, the ecosystem, like how, like as I said, sexual harassment panda loses his job, So what about other people who have to lose their jobs as well, because the money has to go somewhere, So that's all important. And then you see kind of like a series of lawsuits, because everybody's kind of like getting to that pattern of suing people. So it's like what I said, that Gerald is teaching the younger generation that suing people nonstop is the most appropriate thing to do, really. And then towards the end of the episode, the message comes out, which is sexual harassment panda comes back and he says that, okay, I went from sexual harassment panda to don't sue people over frivolous lawsuits panda. And then he kind of explains that. So I think the other message is, how we always have to evolve our messages and evolve our points. Yes, obviously sexual harassment is a big deal. There are a lot of situations. Like, I grew up as a kid of the 90s. Like, I remember going to Wagner Middle School, and there was, like, a situation that was in the newspaper where a teacher sued who was gay because he had students call him a lot of homophobic stuff, and he was actually protecting a student that was also gay because people would be harassing that student. So sometimes there are needed lawsuits. Or I used to work at a college. I used to work at Southern, and there was like a story of a professor deeply stalking a student and repeatedly like getting in trouble for sexual harassment, but not losing their job, really. And it led to a lawsuit. And other things like that. Like definitely lawsuits are very necessary to teach the right message. Sometimes sometimes lawsuits are necessary, but there are other times where people just sue to be vindictive, and people bring things to court to be vindictive, and ultimately, unfortunately, there are also situations where people learn to be manipulative, or be like, okay, you know what, I'm a kid. I'm learning from these adults just to sue people and walk away rich, and that's not good, really. So, if you want to teach sexual harassment and why it's important to advocate when you are sexually harassed, you should also additionally advocate when it really isn't sexual harassment, when it may be for two friends ball busting, or when it may be just or maybe easier to forgive things. Like if a kid in school, like what Mr. Mackey said, where I think Mr. Mackey accused Tweak of making fun of Tweak saying something about his ass or whatever, So, should Mr. Mackey bring that to court or whatever, So sometimes we have to kind of think about how far we want to take our consequences. I think like another great example is, like when I was working like last year, there were two situations where, I was working at night pulling the trash, and I had two patients kick me. So should I just like be like, okay, well, these two older people, they may be a little confused. Should I do something where I call the cops, and then the cops like handcuff them, and then I file assault charges, and then I sue their families and do all that stuff? Like I may feel happy to be like, nobody fucks with me, but am I like living by a good standard of ethics? Could I just say, okay, well, you know what, these two people, you know what they did was an asshole action, but it doesn't mean that I should ruin their lives, or I should even do something where I press charges on them, and they're older people, so them going to jail and possibly getting sick, because obviously jails aren't clean. Or what would happen if I filed something and then they were banned from the hospital, and then they died, a few weeks later because they didn't get treatment because I wanted to be vindictive. So I also think that that's another thing we have to learn from an episode like this, is that it's not just about frivolous lawsuits. It's also just about vindictiveness, and also what we teach the next generation about how to stand up for themselves. How far do we take consequences for other people?